Our reading is in Jonah 3 today, which, by the way, this week is the end of our reading of the Old Testament. So you'll read Jonah 3 today and chapter 4 tomorrow. Friday, Habakkuk 1 to 3, which is what we're going to look at tonight. And then next week we start the Gospel of Matthew. So we'll spend a good chunk of the year. Most of our readings are in the New Testament, and that's on purpose. The Old Testament lays the foundation that is revealed in the New Testament. So the reason we're doing Friday's reading instead of Wednesday's reading tonight is I'm having Jordan preach for me Sunday night because I'm hoping to be with the youth. So I've run in a bit of a wall. If you or anyone you know has some projects around the house that you could use the students to do a project for, please let me know tonight. Because the options I've tried have either not responded or aren't available. We tried to go to Brother Ed's last week, talked to him Monday, didn't really have a whole lot for us to do, and not heard back from the Crisis Center. But nevertheless, if you or someone you know could use a little help around the house, big or small, there's something you need cleaned or moved or mulch or whatever, let me know, and we've got some muscle in the youth, right? And they are very good workers and whatnot. So because of that, we've gone through Jonah before. Habakkuk is is my favorite minor prophet. And often it is overlooked, and yet it develops such a powerful view of the issue of suffering. The book is really about suffering. But really it's more than that. It's suffering that God brings about. So what you don't have here is just man-made cause suffering. And it is that. When the Babylonians come, they're going to kill a lot of people, and they are to blame for that. But it is God who is sovereign over that. It is God who is raising up the Babylonians to judge the Israelites. And so Habakkuk is such an important book because he's a prophet speaking to the Israelites, but you see God speaking to him. I just love it. And so there are three parts to it, and they're broken down pretty accurately in the chapters. It begins in chapter 1, verse 1, into chapter 2, verse 1. And this is Habakkuk's protest. Let's start with the first 4 verses here. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw, O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear, or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. You can get a taste of what his protest is here. And these first 4 verses really sound like some of the Psalms of despair. Oh Lord, how long will you wait to vindicate us? How long will you not protect us? Habakkuk sounds like one of those psalm writers. Well, you can see right here in the first verse is all the background material we have on Habakkuk, right? We get his name, which means embrace. Do with that whatever you want. His calling, he's a prophet. And his prophecy is introduced there in verse 2. O Lord, how long will I cry for help, and you do not hear me? And then you remember we're reading poetry here, and poetry is often emotive, and so you have to read poetry as poetry. So what we should not say is sometimes God doesn't hear our prayers, but rather that poetry is often very subjective in that he's saying it feels as if you're not hearing our prayers. Again, the Psalms are full of this sort of language. And so the context of Habakkuk is important. We've already alluded to. Habakkuk in chapter 1 struggles with 2 realities. One is the Israelites are wicked and deserve judgment. We feel like that as Americans, don't we, right? That you look around thinking, boy, how long before God just says enough is enough, right? I mean, that's a real fear we have. That's why we pray for revival, right? And you know, there's times when you're reading Genesis, you're thinking, boy, if we say, God, if only there's 50 righteous, right? You know, if there's 10 righteous, you know, would you spare them? Because sometimes you wonder if you can find that many. So on the one hand, he realizes Israelites are wicked. On the other hand, he's confused at the instrument of God's judgment for Israel. That's the Babylonians. The Jews were bad. They were wicked, idolatrous people. The Babylonians were far worse. Everywhere they go, they are just murdering innocent people, slaughtering people left and right, destroying property and everything, and all for vainglory. The emperor Nebuchadnezzar, the general. I'm going to get it starts from the end. Is the emperor. They don't care about justice or righteousness. They only care about power and conquering the world. And so he's looking at this. He says, yes, we need judgment, but we would expect righteous judgment from a righteous God. What we wouldn't expect is for God to use the wicked of the most wicked. And remember, in the Bible, Babylon is the peak of human wickedness. It began in Babel, and we talk about some of that in Daniel, and it climaxes in Revelation with a new Babylon. And maybe that's a reference to Rome, maybe it's reference to something future. But Babylon becomes the picture of human wickedness, and a wicked empire at that. And yet God is using Babylon for his instrument of judgment upon his people. So you can see why he is feeling this way. Why do you make me see iniquity? I mean, that's a hard question. Why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention rise. And you see that accusation there, right? The law is ignored, verse 4. Justice isn't upheld. Wicked surrounds the righteous. Justice is perverted. And Habakkuk just doesn't understand why God would tolerate this. Well, he gets a response in verses 5 to 11, okay? Look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded. For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans. That's the ancient word for the Babylonians. The Chaldeans are the ones that destroyed Job's property and whatnot. That bitter and hasty nation who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. The horsemen press proudly on. The horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swift to devour. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on, guilty men whose own might is their God. Now, I want you to notice the tone here. Remember, Habakkuk is saying, how long before you just figure this stuff out? And God's response is, oh, you know those Babylonians that are coming? They're worse than you could even have imagined. And he's almost bragging about how swift they are, how evil they are. And this is why chapter 1, especially if you believe in isolation, it's really shocking, right? Because God is very honest with them. And in fact, notice verse 5, it's look, observe. Notice this, it's emphasis, right? I mention Beowulf all the time because the first word of Beowulf is similar to this. It's listen, heed, right? What follows is really important. So here's God saying, you need to observe just how mighty they are, how powerful they are, how swift they are, and how evil they are. They will destroy and no one can stop them. And he tells them to be astonished and wonder because God is about to do something that Habakkuk cannot fathom. And so if Habakkuk is appalled by what Israel's doing, how much more so with Babylon? And so you get the rise and the triumph of the Babylonians here. We'll just look at them briefly. You need to notice verse 6, it is God who is raising them up. I am doing a work in your days that no one would believe if it didn't tell you. Notice, is it God is taking credit for this? I'm raising up the Babylonians. I'm the one that is doing this. Now we see this throughout the Bible, right? That God is Lord over the nations. He raises up kings. He tears down nations. But at the same time, so that doesn't mean that Babylon is not accountable for their evil actions. It's both and. The Bible swims in that ambiguity. It's both and. If you want a good example of this is when Peter preaches in Pentecost in Acts 2, he'll say, Jesus died according to the plan of God. You crucified him. Well, which is it? Did God see to it that he be crucified, or did you do it? And the answer is yes. So too, you see, God is saying, I've raised up the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar to destroy you. At the same time, the Babylonians have arisen, and they are accountable for their evil actions. And they are to be feared, right? You get in, I'm raising up the Chaldeans, there it is. They are bitter and hasty, verse 6. They march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Notice their definition of justice is their own dignity and power. So they are to be feared. You see them coming and you should run, but you need to know they will catch you. There is no escaping the wrath of the Babylonians. It's weird to read this, isn't it? Because often when we come to the Bible, we want the opposite from God. When we cry out to God, we want the opposite from him. Here, Habakkuk is saying, I just don't understand. Why do you tolerate this? And God shows up and says, let me tell you how bad it's going to get. They will kill, they will slaughter, they will destroy. And you should fear them, Habakkuk. They are unstoppable, right? Verses 8 and 9. The horses are swift and keen. They come riding to devour their foe. Their army is violent, and those who they don't kill, they will capture and they will disperse. They will break up families, break up tribes, right? So Daniel will go towards Babylon, but many others like Jeremiah will go elsewhere. The king, Zedekiah, I believe it is, he will watch his heirs be murdered, and then his own eyes will be gouged out, so that the last thing he saw was the execution of his children. I mean, these are wicked people. Awful, awful people. And God is almost bragging about it. When you read it this way, it sounds like it. And they mock their enemies, anyone that stands between them, right? God repeats himself three times here. At the kings they scoff. At the rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress. In case you didn't hear it the first 2 times. Right? So anyone who they hide behind their walls, they just laugh at that, right? It's not going to stop them. They have no fear. They have great confidence in their army, in their might, and in their leaders. In verse 11, he shows that no one can defend the innocent against their evil. They will sweep in, he says, and no one will stop them. Their strength is their God. They are their own idols. That's interesting. They see how mighty their nation is, and their identity becomes that. No one can stop them. They are too strong. You read this and you just, it's shocking to read, right? Because again, it's not what we're used to. So Habakkuk is praying for justice and righteousness, and this is the answer he gets back. This is a very emotional book, and I think that's the real strength of it. In fact, you'll see starting in verse 12 that Habakkuk responds with being appalled. He can't believe what it is he's hearing from God. And he asks 2 questions. The first one, verse 12 and 13, how can he who is holy allow this? Are you not from everlasting, he says, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for reproof. You who are purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? What a great question that is. You see what Habakkuk is doing is what every Christian must wrestle with when they suffer. How is it that God who is holy can tolerate for so long such wicked unholiness? And how can God, knowing how bad he's going to get, how can God, knowing how evil the Babylonians are, sit by? Remember, Habakkuk is not saying that the Israelites are righteous, but he is saying they're better than what's coming. Right? Why would you let them come in? I mean, these are good questions. His theology, Habakkuk, is sound. He has a high view of God's holiness, high view of his righteousness, high view of God's purity, high view of his justice and righteousness and everything. He's got sound theology. His second question is, has God abandoned his creation? He looked at this and said, okay, when the Babylonians show up, then should I just finally realize God's given up? It's almost like reading the story of Noah, right? That God regretted the day he made mankind. Back to like, oh, this must mean God's just done with us. Absolutely done with us. So you see there, starting in verse 14. You make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his dragnet, so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net, makes offerings to his dragnet, and for by them he lives in luxury, and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? What a question. What a question. I mean, is this just going to continue? Have you abandoned us so that the strong will be the mightiest in the end? Who will speak for the vulnerable? Who will speak for the slave and the abused and the victim? Remember that these are Jews who their main story is how God sided with slaves against the mighty empire in Pharaoh. What they're witnessing is that story in reverse. Instead of God siding with the weak, he seems to be siding with the strong. I mean, what powerful questions we have here. Notice these final words in chapter 2, verse 1. I will take my stand at my watchpost, station myself on the tower, look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. Interesting, isn't it, that Habakkuk describes this as a complaint, complaining to God, which I always like to remind people that your prayer should be one of honesty. And making it sound like King James doesn't make you a spiritual person. God prefers honest prayers. Habakkuk is a great example of this. David does this in the Psalms. Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, wrote a whole book called Lamentations by which he laments to God. Jesus, take this cup from me. An honest prayer. Well, he has voiced his concerns to God, and now he waits for God to respond. As he's going to, the NASB calls it a guard post. Most translations, or some translations, describe it as a watchtower. It's interesting because a watchtower, the purpose of a watchtower is to look out for the enemy. So he's heard what God is going to do. He's filed his complaint. He climbs the watchtower and he looks out and he waits for God to speak while the Babylonians are marching to Zion. I just love the imagery there. I just love it. So that's Habakkuk's protest. In chapter 2, we get divine providence. And this is key to the book because Habakkuk is stuck in the present. I don't understand what you are doing now. And what God shows Habakkuk is, you need to learn to see things from my vantage point. So I've used this illustration before. When Amanda was in high school, she was in color guard. And I go to every football game to watch her at halftime. I go to some of her competitions and stuff. And my sister was also in color guard. And one of the things I found is if you were to stand on the sidelines, right, even with the band, it just looked like they were just running all over the place, and it was weird. But none of the judges are at eye level. All the judges are as high as they can possibly get. So too, if you went to the top of the bleachers, you could see what isn't chaos there on the field. It's actually organization. Whether they were spelling out words and making shapes, or they were organizing instruments here and there, whatever it is that they were doing. And you could really see with the color guard, the flags that they were doing. And Amanda had a solo, and when she did her solo, she was always in a certain spot, the center of attention for this solo. She's not over in the back somewhere. Everything was very organized. And the difference is one of perspective. If you're down there, it looks chaotic, and you can't understand what the band is doing. But if you have a better vantage point where you can see everything all at once, then you can see how the pieces are fitting together. So too, when it comes to present suffering, we're blinded by what is before us. Right? I don't understand why these things are happening to me, or how I'm going to get through the day or the weekend or the month or whatever it is. But from God's perspective, he sees not just the present sufferings, he sees the long view of things. And so he can brag about how bad the Babylonians are. And if we could use the word brag, that's not really what he's doing. Because in chapter 2, he's going to demonstrate that he has already condemned and judged the Babylonians. He's well aware of what's about to happen to the Jews. But Habakkuk needs to know that all of his prayers will be, and in a very real sense, have already been answered. because God isn't stuck in the present. He sees the whole picture. And we know what happens to the Babylonians, right? 70 years of judgment by which then finally God shows up. So I don't want to spend forever on chapter 2. To do a little bit of skipping here. I don't know if... So basically what God is going to say is that they reap what they sow. So verses 6 to 8, the plunderers will be plundered, the looters will be looted, that sort of language. Verses 9 through 11 of chapter 2, they claim that they are secure, but they will be destroyed. Verses 12 to 14, they who overcome the nations will be overcome by the nations, overthrown by the nations. Verses 15 to 17, those who are shameless will be brought to shame. And he uses an alcohol metaphor throughout the book. So he'll say in verse 16, you will be filled with disgrace rather than honor. All right, you will be drunken with disgrace. And it's significant is that it is God who is doing these things. So verse 14, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So just as it is true that God is the one raising up the Babylonians, God is the one who has, in a very real sense, already destroyed the Babylonians. The issue is perspective. That doesn't mitigate the suffering the Jews are about to go through in real human time. But he's reminded of, this is not the end of the story. My promises still remain, and that I am still a righteous God that condemns evil. Okay? And he is showing Habakkuk that is exactly what I'm going to do. Verse 16, the second half. Actually, just read the whole thing. You will have your feel of shame instead of glory. Drink yourself and show your uncircumcision. So that there's that alcohol reference. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. Now, where else have I heard that imagery of a cup? It's the cup of God's judgment. Of course, so now you understand the imagery, right? They've been drinking, right? And they think they're drinking to their own glory and praise and honor and might. And God is saying, no, what you're drinking is the cup of God's wrath. And the day will come, you'll be so drunk, you'll fall in judgment. And if my reading of Daniel is right, isn't Belshazzar pretty drunk when he's murdered? Isn't the Mene Tekel Parson? Didn't we read that? Was he drunk? I think there was a feast or something going on there, you know? When it's like Habakkuk, man, he's telling him, you're going to drink so much that God's judgment is going to fall down. So the message is, yes, you reap what you sow, but ultimately, it is God is answering the age-old question, why do the wicked prosper? His answer is, they do not. How we perceive it may look like they are, but from God's vantage point, they absolutely do not. They absolutely do not. So Habakkuk is stuck in his watchtower, and he realizes God is ruling from his throne. So as high as Habakkuk can get, it's inadequate compared to God's vantage point. Well, this leads to the better known part of Habakkuk chapter 3, particularly the conclusion. And so here we have Habakkuk's prayer. So we've had protest, providence, and prayer. There you go. It's alliterated, so you know it is spiritual. So he cries out for grace in verses 1 to 2. Now you'll notice this how it begins. So this is basically a psalm. Not all the psalms are in the collection book of Psalms. There are other psalms. David wrote psalms that aren't in the 150 psalms. Solomon wrote psalms. Moses wrote psalms. Miriam wrote a song. Here's one by Habakkuk. It says, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet according to the Shigionoth. Does anyone have a note on Shigionoth? I strangely do not. Anyone have a note? I'm surprised we don't. Yeah, that's our best guess. Yeah, it's there are some Hebrew words we're just not entirely for sure what they mean. There's a lot in Psalms that may reference instruments or a musical note. I know nothing about music. My daughter came up to me today and she said, and she's doing piano like Elijah, and she said, look at this that I have to learn to play next piano. And I have no idea what I'm looking at, right? I read dead guys. I don't read music. And I say, well, it looks easy to me. Quarter note, quarter note, quarter note, quarter note, quarter note, half note, quarter note, quarter. Now, it's more complicated than that, but I don't know what I'm reading, right? And she goes, well, do you know what this means? No. I don't care about any of this, right? And she told me what it was. Still have no idea what it is that she said, right? And maybe 1,000 years from now, when the English language is no longer around, people struggle reading some of our musical notes, and so there are a few words we don't really know. But what Mary shared there is it likely references a highly emotive prayer or psalm, and we have those. One of my favorite Switchfoot songs and Jars of Clay songs are very similar. Switchfoot's song off of the Nothing to Sound album called Blues. It's a song about suffering, where he's I've read from it in a sermon before. He's just crying out. I'm trying to understand what in the world's going on here. It's very emotive. Jars of Clay has one called Silence. It's very similar to it, and it's hard to get through, right? Very, very emotive. So here it is. O Lord, I have heard the report of you and your work, O Yahweh. Notice Yahweh mentioned twice there. And I fear, right? Do I fear? In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. Boy, I think it's something worth meditating on. If tonight, if you meditated on in wrath, remember mercy. And as you read your Bible, how often in God's wrath does he remember mercy? Like when he found grace in the eyes of Noah. Isn't that in the middle of wrath he remembered mercy? Or when Jesus put on flesh and walked among us. And that's the beauty of it. God came from Teman and the Holy One from Mount Paran. Now, if you were writing this psalm, where would you think God came from? If you were to pick a geographical location, where would you think God would come from? Would it not be Jerusalem? But that's not what he says here. He says he comes from Mount Paran. What those are describing is Teman was in northwest Edom. Mount Paran is the hilly region from the western border of the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, what he is remembering here is God's deliverance and salvation at both the Red Sea and the wilderness. Notice what Habakkuk did there. He says, in your wrath. And what he's not saying is, you shouldn't judge us or any of that, but rather he's saying, amidst that, show grace. Undeserved grace, but show it. And he anchors that hope not in his fear or in his emotions. He looks back at the God who has shown mercy amid wrath when the waters parted and the Jews just walked right through. When in the wilderness they continually revolted against God, wanting to become slaves again. God continually to show them mercy. That's what he's praying. He said, I don't have to understand everything that's going on here, but I can trust you've got it all figured out, and I know by your past actions, even amid judgment and wrath, you are a God of mercy. Isn't that what we're told to do in the New Testament? Read Revelation again in light of this. Do the Christians suffer mightily? Yeah. We hear them crying out, the voice of the martyrs, under the altar in heaven. And what does Jesus do? He takes blood-dipped robes and he covers them. And what he's saying is, remember who I am and what I've done. The time will come when this will be no more. We are always told to look back on the anchor by which we stand on, that Christ has entered into our suffering. He has conquered it by the empty tomb. This is the good news of the gospel. In wrath, remember mercy. The hope of the church now. I mean, we've said, like, we sort of deserve something here. But we also pray our hope is mercy. We deserve nothing, but we are praying for so much. Part of the way you can see this is how Habakkuk is written in different tenses in the generic sense. Chapter 1 is the present tense. He wants to know, what are you doing now? Explain to me what's happening now, right? In chapter 2, it's the future tense, right? God is pointing us to what is about to come. 70 years from now, the Babylonians will fall. And the wicked nation, the empire that comes to them, they will fall, right? Do not underestimate that I am well aware it's happening, and the day will come when the wicked will pay for what they've done. In chapter 3, it's now we're going to go past. So you see that the questions you have about the present will be answered in the future, and we know that because of what God has demonstrated in the past. This is why reading our Bible is important. It's why having the gospel and the cross of Jesus at the very center of it. Notice that his splendor covers the heavens and the earth is full of his praise. When God acted in Egypt, it resulted in his praise. Go read the Exodus story. God did what he did so that the nations will give him glory. And notice the emphasis on power in verse 4. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand. There he veiled his power. His power is overcoming. He had to veil it. It was too much, right? And then verses 8 to 15, we see God as a mighty warrior. And we don't have time to go in all of it. You can read it for yourself, where God just shows up and people tremble. And you can compare the language of what he described Babylon to now how he's described. He's far more mightier. He's far more fearsome, right? He is far more powerful than the little Babylonians. He is a mighty warrior, an image of God we never really consider. Well, I want us to conclude as he does. Start in verse 16. I hear, and my body trembles. Something else worth meditating on, right? Habakkuk doesn't have it all figured out yet, I don't think. But he's willing to anchor his future on the God who has demonstrated his glory and praise and mercy in the past. He's saying, okay, I stand in my watchtower, and they're coming. They're coming. And I will likely be among those slaughtered, tortured, and killed. I hear what God says, and I tremble. I love that. This is why I love Habakkuk. It's very emotive and it's very honest. My lips quiver at the sound. I mean, this is good writing. Good writing. It's good poetry. Rottenness enters into my bones, and my lips tremble beneath me. Here's the question. He fears the Babylonians, but we should fear the Lord more. Yet, I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon the people who invade us. He will patiently persevere in suffering, trusting in God's good glory. I will sit here in my watchtower and wait. Habakkuk will probably never see the destruction of Babylon. I don't know what happens to him. Maybe he's a casualty of Nebuchadnezzar's war. I don't know. Here's the conclusion, and it is just beautiful. I hope you highlight in your Bible and you come to it often. It's one of those Bible passages, I don't know why it's not hanging on our walls more. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food. The flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Well, that's not good. Notice there will be no figs, there will be no fruit, there will be no food, there will be no flock. Everything destroyed, devastated. If God takes all of that away, all of it, notice this, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Now, God's not going to save him. He's going to sit on his watchtower, and Nebuchadnezzar will see to it he's killed in a brutal way. His hope of salvation is bigger than the present. Isn't that incredible to read? God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like deer's feet. He makes me tread on high places, higher than that little watchtower he's sitting in. And there it is to the choir master with string instruments. What a powerful ending to that, isn't it? I could lose everything I've ever owned, and everything I have my security in, everything I have my prosperity in, everything I've ever hoped for, family and income, career, retirement, and economy, a nation. I can lose it all, yet I will rejoice. And in getting to that point is where a lot of American evangelicals are being held back at. I've witnessed far too many people, the instant of momentary affliction, they abandon their faith. Here, Habakkuk knows it's coming and there is no escape. Yet because he encountered a God of wrath who is a God of mercy, he concludes, God can take it all away, yet I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. But there's a question Piper likes to ask, I've asked it before, that if you were to be given everything you ever had, and ever wanted, ever desired, along with it in this world that we dream of, there is no suffering, no sin, no loss, no nothing. Just everything you could ever want or imagine. Yet Christ was not there. Would you call it heaven? At the same time, if you had nothing you ever desired, nothing you ever dreamed of, and yet Christ was there, would it be hell? I think it's an important question to ask. Because Habakkuk thinks God's promises here are limited by Jews occupying the land. And he can't figure out, why is God allowing the things to happen? A question we still ask today. Maybe you ask it every time you turn on the news. And what he discovers is that God's grace is bigger than my mind can fathom. He could take it all away, yet I will rejoice. That's where we want to be as Christians and as a church and as a people of God. Anything you guys see here? No. Just a little minor prophet. Minor not because he's not significant, but because it's short. And how often we just skip those 12 minor prophets. And they're so good. I don't understand all of them, but it's so good. In our time here, we've looked at Nahum and Joel and Jonah. And I'm trying to think if there's another one. Nahum was a real struggle for me, but Habakkuk is just so good. So good. I hope you return to it often. Okay, well, how about we close out in prayer? You're getting out 4 minutes early, so there you go. All right, let's